Living a life in full is a conversation you always wanted to have with that person who gave an amazing TED Talk, or the author of one of your favorite books, or that inspirational Olympian you always wanted to know more about. It's graduate-level conversations with those making a difference in the world and in the lives of others. This show brings you new ideas and approaches so that you can live a life in full. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Stout, and I hope you enjoy this episode. This episode is brought to you by the nonprofit I founded, the Center for Global Initiatives. The Center is an all-volunteer organization, so there are no salaries, and thus all tax-deductible donations can go to the work. While our key country partner is in Tanzania, our work is global and generally focused in the areas of education and healthcare. We also help others to get their nonprofits started or augment others' project-based initiatives. It's our goal to open-source humanitarian intervention and to help make it easier for others to do more good in the world. We are proud to have been ranked a great nonprofit every year since 2011 and to have achieved a platinum-level rating by GuideStar. Links in this episode's show notes will take you to published articles on our outcomes, a number of helpful tools, and downloadable resources, which are all free, always. Please visit us at centerforglobalinitiatives.org and be sure to watch our video at patreon.com/Dr. Chris Stout to learn more. Thanks. Welcome to another episode of Living Life in Full. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Stout. We are not as smart as we think we are. We're busy and distracted in a world that is incentivized to continually make us more of both. The only things that work, the only messages that cut through the noise are sharp, clear, and direct. Think about the most powerful messages you've ever heard. Picture the most life-changing piece of advice passed down from a mentor, the most stirring call to action in a stump speech, or the stickiest slogan ever splashed across a commercial. We've all been advised to not judge a book by its cover, to not count your chickens before they hatch, and that Rome wasn't built in a day. Maybe for you, what comes to mind is something political, like Patrick Henry's revolutionary "Give me liberty" or "Give me death," or more recently, Barack Obama's "Yes, we can." In the halls of great marketing, you might remember Apple's "Think Different," Nike's "Just Do It," or Disney's "The Happiest Place on Earth." Now, think for a second about the other few thousand messages you've heard in the past 24 hours. Things told to you like ads, warnings, instructions, or even things you've sought out, like articles, social media posts, or stories. How many of them do you actually remember? How many of the things that you've said do other people remember? Do they actually ever hear what you're saying? The answer is simple. Literally, simple. Regardless if these messages are trying to get your dollars, your votes, or just your thoughts, the most effective messages all share one thing. They are simple. Simple ideas stick. Simple messages win. But why do some messages work when others don't? Why do some ideas break through? Why do some slogans stick in your brain? And why do some leaders inspire change when others don't? Ben Guttmann can answer all these questions and will in this episode. Ben's interested in the things and ideas that move people, why we make the decisions we make, why we vote who we vote for, why we buy the products we buy, and ultimately, why do we do what we do? Ben co-founded and built and ran the Digital Natives Group, an award-winning marketing agency based in New York City, starting out with local ice cream parlors and the local camera repair shop, and growing into partnerships with the NFL, I Love New York, Comcast NBC Universal, the Nature Conservancy, and other notable brands. Through their publishing practice, they helped launch over 60 best-selling books from every major imprint, including titles from Nobel laureates, Fortune 500 CEOs, Hollywood screenwriters, and Pulitzer Prize winners. After winning more than 60 industry awards, including prestigious Webby and Shorty nods, they sold Digital Natives Group in 2021. For a decade, Ben has been teaching marketing at Baruch College, the largest business school in the nation, and his work or writing has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Publishers Weekly, Lifehacker, Crane's New York Business, and other outlets. He's spoken at colleges, conferences, and meetings, from Internet Week to Warsaw University, from New York Tech Meetup to New York University. And most proudly, out of all that, he has periodically organized and hosted the perennially sold-out Queen's Tech Night Meetup series. Welcome to the show, Ben. It's great to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris. It's great to be here.
Well, first off, I want to ask, how do you and Michael Shine know each other? And for context, Michael is my only three-time guest on the show, and he's made this introduction for Ben and I.
Michael is wonderful. I've known Michael for, I don't even know how long at this point. So when I ran Digital Natives Group, as you mentioned there, we teamed up on a few different projects over the years. I think another Michael, a friend of ours, Michael Roderick, actually, he might have introduced us years ago. But when Michael Shine told me he was writing his book and what the topic was, I absolutely adored it, and I followed along for the whole process. And he, in turn, when I was deciding to write my book, was incredibly supportive and really great kind of mentor and ally kind of through the process as well, because he did it just a couple of years before I did. And by the way, for anybody listening who hasn't read his book, highly recommend it, The Hype Handbook.
Yeah, here. Yeah, and I'll put in our show notes too, I'll have links back to those episodes. So he and I joke sort of a la Saturday Night Live, like when you've been a host for X number of times on the show or something, you get like a smoking jacket. And I think he and I decided, since he's been my three-time guest, he's going to get a bathrobe. In the introduction, I covered your professional bona fides, but could you maybe share with us what got you into marketing, what your journey was like with college, getting started post-college, that trajectory?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess my first exposure to marketing from kind of a practitioner side was my high school actually had a business department. And a lot of high schools, don't have anything of the sort, but I was fortunate to be in a district where we had those type of resources. And my first business class was sports marketing when I was in ninth grade. And I'll tell you, I probably didn't learn too much marketing in that class. We spent a lot of time playing fantasy football and and like taking tours of Madison Square Garden. But that was my first exposure to business as a discipline in general, marketing as a discipline in particular. And from there, I really kind of just gelled to the topic, right? And when I was in college, I was the big student government dork. I was the president of my student government my senior year. And so I was really busy doing all that. While I was a marketing major, I didn't do a lot of the internships that you're supposed to do, right? I didn't do a lot of the agency stuff. But thankfully, I had a professor who ran his own agency up in Westchester, so just north of the city. Mm-hmm. And he basically came to me one day and said, I know you want to, maybe start your own thing. We're looking for some help with digital. Maybe we can figure something out. And so I grabbed a friend and the two of us met with him and his partner over the course of the summer and figured out, that we'll start our shop. We'll set up shop in their basement in Westchester. I took the reverse commute out of the city in my 94 Honda Accord, which was surprisingly made it to the office every time without breaking down. And that was, kind of the beginning of the professional journey there. A lot of stuff I did, if it was in high school or in college, that touched marketing. That's just, I think, kind of a universal skill. Mm-hmm. But being kind of a professional, which is to get somebody to pay you to do it, is a whole different ballgame. We did a little bit of work with that agency over the course of the next few months. But to be honest, they were working with like Fortune 500 clients, and we were these two kind of, two or three like kind of knuckleheads, who just graduated college. We didn't quite know what we were doing. So there wasn't a ton of fit, honestly, between the work that they were doing upstairs and what we did downstairs. Still a lot of mentorship that we got out of that process. And so we ended up actually cutting our teeth on the stuff you mentioned, like the local ice cream shop, local camera shop, somebody's, one of the clients' cousins ran a real estate company. And so all these things, start to roll together, and you start to build your own little book of business. And so we were in that basement there for about a year before we kind of set out on our own and and got an office down in Queens.
Wow. So that's really pretty quick. And then that was the genesis of the Digital Natives Group, or was that a prelude to that, or where does Digital Natives come in?
Yeah. So our company was called Digital Natives Group. We were digital based, kind of like, we were kind of like an ally, like a strategic partner of the agency upstairs, but we were always our own company. We were always, our own brand. But when after about a year, we realized there wasn't enough, kind of work coming in from upstairs, and there's a lot more work coming in from our connections down in the city. And also we all lived in the city. So we decided to look around, try to find an office space. There was a neighborhood called Long Island City in Queens, which at the time was very industrial, still is a little bit industrial, but now it's become a very booming kind of mixed use residential community. And I got connected with a landlord there who, must have somehow trusted, these now 22-year-old knuckleheads with getting an office. And we got this weird industrial space, slapped a logo on that wall, and filled it with IKEA furniture. So that was our first like kind of real office. And I got to tell you, I mean, as a kind of a marketing tip, a little bit too, if you are in the professional services business, having a real office, may seem like an expense, but it was completely an asset for us because it became something that made us very real and tangible in a way that every other person going around saying, "Hey, we'll build a mobile app for you," that was just kind of working out of Starbucks. They weren't able to land the same type of business because they didn't look as real. They weren't as trustworthy by some of the bigger clients that you might be seeking out.
That's great. Well, and I can just sort of imagine what that industrial space looked like. What time period is this? What years?
That was in 2012. I think we signed that.
Gotcha.
So it was an interesting moment where 2010, 2012, that was where kind of social media marketing really kind of kicked into high gear. That was when mobile really became a thing. And I think that our name, honestly, and our age, being Digital Natives Group, was something that was a real asset to us at that time.
I believe it. Yeah. It really kind of harkens back to that time and the whole tribe, who's your tribe and that vibe back then. I guess maybe to kind of pick your brain a little bit, I've had guests on too that are academics, but also come from a background of business and understand kind of what it's like to be applied and in the real world. And a lot of authors too, as we talked off mic before. But what is it like for you? What is your process vis-a-vis creativity how do you spool that up for a client or a campaign? I mean, you go from ice cream parlors and real estate businesses to the NFL, so I mean, it's not like you're like in a specific niche. I mean, and even then when you're talking about like social media, I mean, maybe that's a meta niche or something to say, well, this is how do people consume this? How do we get the eyeballs, et cetera. But what is that process like for you of you've inked a deal, you got a new client. Where do you start?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple different pieces to that. The first one is, so there's a book that there's a type foundry of designers called House Industries. They're very famous in the space. And you've probably seen their work in the wild without knowing it. They have a monograph that they released a couple of years ago called "The Process is the Inspiration." Oh. And that title alone, I think, is enough of a design lesson and creativity lesson for for most people. So I adhere to that, which is, the process is the inspiration. If you're a professional, you don't wait around for the creativity to strike, right? You don't wait around to be inspired by something. You seek it out and you go through a process, and that's different for everybody, that will help you get there. Every project we did started with some sort of discovery process. And so this is something that, you got better at over time, right? We weren't as good about it in the beginning. As we start to punch up and we do more of those things like the NFL and everything else, you get to a point where your process involves, there might be on-site meetings, there might be off-site meetings. Maybe you're interviewing customers, maybe you're interviewing other stakeholders, maybe you're doing qualitative research. We worked with Grand Central Terminal for a number of years, And I remember standing on the concourse, at Grand Central, right under the clock there, flagging down tourists to ask them, about X, Y, or Z, right? And so that type of thing, it's very awkward sometimes, but it's extremely important in terms of being able to figure out, the insights that you need to do your stuff. So that's one piece of it. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would say is, you mentioned kind of going from client to client. There are kind of two types of businesses in this space. If you're in the professional services, especially creative professional services space. Mm-hmm. And I like to describe them in the shorthand of, there's like the bright lights of Broadway, where you're saying, hey, I want to do this like sexy, cool work for these big brands and win awards and be featured in this magazine and that one. And you seek out the big novel projects. Maybe they're different from each other. There's another type of business, which is, I want to do landing pages for orthodontists, right? And I just do landing pages for orthodontists, and I do them every single day. I have a team that's done 1,000 of them. They know exactly what makes for a good landing page, and we do them over and over and over, and they're perfected. One of those businesses isn't necessarily better than the other one. We did much more of the former, right? Uh-huh. Where we had different projects in different industries every single day. And I still have a lot of that work that I do with different folks. The latter, though, is frankly probably a better business if you're looking about just generating the most amount of profit, is to say, I have a system, I have a very specific target market, mm-hmm. and I do the same thing over and over and over again.
I like that. I mean, it's almost like the Henry Ford version, And then I would imagine too, with that, the iterative process of that, of having the familiarity, knowing the market, knowing both sides of the who the providers are, who the consumers are, so to speak. That then, when there is something, when you do have that new client, it's not like you're creating a prototype, like going back to my car metaphor, it's not like you're creating a new car, a new prototype every time, from the ground mm-hmm. up, which is going to have lots of, the mirror's going to fall off, the tire's going to go flat, those kinds of things. So how do you, maybe this is a meta question, how do you create your own collaterals? How do you create your own logos? How do you choose your own colors and fonts and stuff when you are making the digital nomad group? I mean, how does that, obviously you workshop those things with each other or whatever, but how does that, I mean, it's sort of like you're doing it for yourself, and you must have some vision to say, well, we want to be scalable, so we don't want to necessarily have some unintended consequence of looking like all we're going to do is help bakeries. we want to be available to anybody that comes knocking on our door. Mm-hmm. What was that like to do it for yourself?
Yeah, so there's a kind of turn of phrase that I'm very fond of with that, which is, the painter's house is never painted.
Yeah. I like that. I've never heard that.
There's the alternative, which is like, the shoemaker's son walks barefoot.
That's good.
And so I found those both to be very true. There's always another client thing to deal with. There's always somebody who, if you're fortunate, if you do good work in terms of business development, always somebody is willing to pay for your time as opposed to you doing it for yourself. That's using that time to do your own stuff. Uh-huh. So it's very hard in any creative field to do that for yourself. We had to make it a kind of explicit point to go through those motions with our own stuff. When it started to feel a little painful that we didn't like the stuff that we had, right? So we put up our first website, and eventually that feels like, it's not it anymore. You got to go make the next website. But it always lasts a little bit longer than you would want it to. And you're also, the other thing that happens with anybody in a creative field is that you are your worst client, right? So with real clients, you have boundaries and you have processes and you have this and that. It's very hard to go through the same kind of formal process for yourself that you would be doing for another client.
Gotcha.
I think it's very important to do it. I think that there's something I tell my students this, and I've seen it, I've used it a lot in my own career, which is I look at the idea of these kind of 3 or 4 professional force multipliers. So a force multiplier in like military parlance is like a fortress, right? It's something that makes you multiple times better, equipped than you were before, multiple times more powerful. A helicopter is a force multiplier, right? Like those type of
Okay.
things. GPS is a force multiplier. In a professional context, I have found that writing, if you're able to be a good writer, that is a very powerful force multiplier. A lot of people are not great writers, and a lot of people are just very uncomfortable with it. I think a lot of people can be great writers, they just choose to not exercise that muscle a lot of times. I think that presenting, same thing. A lot of people can be a great presenter. Not as many people kind of exercise the muscle to do it if they feel like they can get up on a stage and present their work, or make a speech or a toast or anything like that. I think that design is the other kind of production one, which is if you're really good at design, there's a bit of a, it's a bit of a cheat code, right? You can have maybe not the best content, but if it's designed really attractively, it will be chosen, if it's a proposal or something like that, right? If your proposal looks like, wow, these guys really have the design chops because they showed it in this document, well, I'm more likely to choose them because, it seems like they're going to be better at communicating and doing creative work otherwise.
Gotcha.
And so I think that design is a little bit harder. I think that everybody has the ability to be better at design. I think that there is a certain amount of kind of innate ability when it comes to that. But I think that everybody could be a better speaker, everybody could be a better writer, and those make you better as a professional overall. And to go back to just the question for a second, was design for ourselves was a differentiator in the beginning because we had very strong design ability in-house, and that helped us separate our presentation from some of the other folks that were maybe competing in the same space.
Gotcha. So speaking of that then, so like working with your team, you're a co-founder, did you have a staff? Did you use freelance? Did you say, okay, we've got this bid for a contract on XYZ product or company or brand or whatever, and they want, these deliverables, blah, blah, blah. Like, do you go through your Rolodex and say, okay, here's our great, copywriter, and they're going to come up with a great slogan, and here's our great, graphic artist, and they're going to come up with a, great logo, blah, 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 or what? Step us through, like, what happens, when you're trying to make that pitch, and then presumably maybe that same team stays with you if you've been awarded the contract and you deliver on it.
Yeah, so this is an interesting business because it's very much dependent upon, who's hot. Did you get the project? Did you lose the project? We had a full-time staff, about 15 folks. They're kind of our peak, and that included designers, that included developers, that included copywriters, account managers, administrative staff, strategists, ad people, and so we were able to do, I would say, depending on the project, about 90% of it, 99% of it in-house. Maybe sometimes you don't want to hire somebody like a photographer or videographer until you get to a certain size because you just don't need that often.
Sure.
Development is one of those things. So we would do, from branding and social media all the way through, we would do websites and mobile apps. And we had some development ability on staff, but it was much more that they were kind of the technical director type of job rather than the kind of full-time execution type of job, because that's also one of those things that again, it can be very expensive to hire somebody locally for that job. That's just kind of the nuts and bolts economics of that type of industry. But also the stuff you need is often so varied. It's better for you to have a little bit bigger of a team or people you can kind of bring in from here, from here and there from time to time to work on stuff. We would have like a Rolodex of videographers, photographers, etc. We would have kind of swing help if we got too many things and we needed some more copywriters. We would bring in extra folks on a freelance basis. But we tried to build a kind of full-time team as much as we could. And I think that also starts to become a differentiator at a certain point too, whereas smaller companies might understand, oh, you have a couple of guys and then you're just kind of freelancing outside. But as you get bigger and you deal with bigger contracts, there's more of an expectation that you have that talent on staff, not that you're just kind of a middleman between the talent and the client.
Gotcha. I have a couple more quick
Yep.
pick kinds of questions. So, like you co-founded, did you and your co-founder co-CEO like some companies do? Was someone a COO and a CEO? Did you have that kind of a structure, or more of a flatter hierarchy, or how did you manage the leadership aspects of it?
Yeah, so we had a couple of folks, and it changed in the first couple of years. There, our kind of structure changed a bit, and there were a couple partners. Overall though, I would say in the beginning, you're very tempted to use CEO as a title and put on your business card and on LinkedIn, but then you realize like you're CEO of like, at the time, a very small company with like no money, and it's like, who are you kidding? So eventually we just transitioned all of our titles to just partner. And sometimes we would add modifiers to that, like managing partner or creative director or something like that. It depended on who you were talking to and what context, what you would actually use. Because sometimes it backfires to use a bigger title, right? And I've known folks that run one-person companies, just them, and their business card just says creative director on it, or like senior strategist. And I think that's a very savvy way to do it, because if I meet somebody and they were what I was then, a 22-year-old, kid, not really knowing what he's doing, and he handed me a business card and it said CEO on it. As well, CEO of what?
Right.
CEO of just
of me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But if you hand me a business card that says like creative director or something, okay, I'm much that actually lines up a lot more with what you're doing on a day-to-day basis than being a Bob Iger type of guy. Right.
Yeah. It seems much more authentic. If you don't have, minions underneath you, then any C-suite kind of moniker seems a little, disingenuous. So maybe that's my final question and we can get on. I want to get into your book. So you guys sold in 2021. Was it to private equity? Did you get bought up by a larger interest, or what? Tell us maybe a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that was an interesting process in and of itself. We started the sale in 2021. I finished transitioning out of it in 2022. But we ran the business for 10 years. It was a lot of fun, and every year was better than the previous year. Even during COVID, COVID was
bravo,
shocking.
Wow,
thank you. Yeah, COVID was like a shock to the system, but it was something that ended up actually being a good year for us in 2020 because more people shifted their budgets to digital. But a time comes when you've done something for 10 years, and especially at the beginning of your career, it's hard to look at it and say, do I want to do it for another 10 years? Do I want to do the same thing for another 10 years? Had a ton of fun, again, with my partners, with my employees, our clients. Everybody was great. We were profitable. There was no gun to our head to do it, but we had a little bit of an itch to see what else can we explore, and an opportunity. We were fortunate to take advantage of was we always had a little bit of interest. I'll tell you this, which is when you are running an agency and you're 25 and you're 28, you're 30, whatever it is, there are going to be people who are also running agencies, but they are 55 and 60 and 65, and they look around and they say, well, I only maybe have another 5 or 10 years I want to do this, but I don't have anybody on my staff that I want to be, that I can see being kind of the next leadership here. But I see these younger guys, they've already kind of pulled it off. Maybe there's some interest in kind of joining forces. That type of equation happened a few times in our process over the course of 10 years. So we were familiar with, we explored them until they didn't make sense always. But we ended up selling partial. We sold in kind of two pieces. We sold part to an agency that was a little bit like that. And then we sold the other part to a private equity firm that was rolling up a fewer smaller agencies to make an in-house team.
Wow, that's great. Good. And you're happy with your exit and things went as smooth as those kinds of things can go?
Yeah, I'm very proud of two things. Number one is that we had a home for every
Oh,
client, and we had
good.
a job for every employee. So
Perfect.
that was very important
Wow.
for us as we're going through.
Well, and for those that don't know, I've worked with private equity and VC and a number of founders and whatnots, and that is not always, the way that you can wrap things up. So again, bravo, well done with with the exit and being able to do it and keep people whole.
Thank
That's
you.
the tip of the hat. Well, let's now shift into discussing your new book. Again, it's
Mhm.
called Simply Put: Why Clear Messages Win and How to Design Them. But Ben, if you don't mind, before we do, I want to share what a few others have had to say about it. And they're pretty notable as well. William Ury, the New York Times bestselling co-author of Getting to Yes, said that simple can be hard, but Ben Guttmann's lucid and valuable book makes it much easier. Jonathan Fields, host of The Good Life Project and best-selling author of Sparked, said, Simply Put is a revelation. Bursting with clear, actionable insights, it's required reading for anyone with something to say, solve, or sell. And our best buddy Michael Shine said, and I put a plug in for the Hype Handbook, commented that one of my core beliefs, and this sounds so much like Michael, has always been that boiling complex messages into simple maxims is one of the best ways to benevolently brainwash anyone. The question is, how do you do it? Ben's new book finally gives us the answer in a big way. We finally have the definitive text on how to execute radical simplicity in the real world and get anything you want as a result. And finally, the Unmistakable Creative listed your book as one of their top 10 books in 2023, calling it an invaluable guide for anyone wanting to improve their communication skills. Holy smokes, Ben! Very, very well-deserved praise, and I think maybe the last bouquet here I can toss. Fact check me because I know that sometimes the internet actually isn't factual all the time, but I believe it was named one of the 3 finalists for the Independent Book Publishers Association's Benjamin Franklin Award in the Business and Career category. Did I get that fact correct? Is that right?
You got it correct, but there's actually another piece of that, which is it actually won.
Hey,
I appreciate
excellent.
that.
Congratulations. Good. Well, I teed that
Thank
up
you.
well for you, didn't I? Well,
Yeah, I mean,
good. Good.
that was a big honor. That one happened
Wow.
very recently, and I've connected with a couple of the other nominees, and they're incredible folks who've written great books as well. So it was an honor to be nominated next to them, and to receive that recognition is it
Bravo.
makes me very very
Well,
proud.
and
Yeah.
I mean, also too, for maybe listeners that aren't necessarily familiar with this, that is a very crowded field and category. So, being a finalist is no easy task. Boiled to 3, but then being number 1 on the podium is again well deserved. It really oh, bravo, man, that's great. So, my classic question, big surprise. What you've done all these things. You teach. You've had this really kind of cool career and in an interesting time for 10 years, had a wonderful exit. What inspired you to write this book?
So, one thing that came up over and over again in my work with clients and has come up again and again in my work with students, and also just as a kind of user of the world, is the same question, which is, well, why do some messages work and others don't? Right. So this is a question that clients will pay you to figure out. Right. What is a message that I could, send, and what's the ad, what's the website look like, whatever it is, that's going to sell more widgets. Students will ask me that because they're trying to figure out what they want to do kind of in their career. And just as a curious person going around, I would look and say, well, why do some of these things work and why do the other ones don't? And so after selling the business, I had a little bit more freedom to kind of explore this, because when you're in the business, you're kind of just solving it, right? And you don't always actually know what you're solving until you're able to take a step back and look and say, okay, well, what is the commonality between all the different stuff? And so I looked at I looked at the research, I looked at the data, I looked at the history, and I looked just anecdotally at what were some of the great kind of case studies here. And I arrived at this appropriately simple answer, which is that the messages that work best are simple. And I say this on page 1 of the book, actually, and I joke that, like, if that's enough for you, then, like, don't read the other
Right.
200 pages of it,
Yeah.
right?
The end.
Yeah, that's it. Like, simple ideas win. So, like, go ahead. But it turns out that, well, the science behind why is surprisingly deep, and the science behind how is surprisingly hard. So that's what we end up with the rest of that book, is that how do we get to something that's simple? Simple is something that's easily perceived, understood, and acted upon. And what does all that stuff mean?
Well, and I'm a clinical psychologist, and I haven't practiced for ages. But back in the day, one of the issues was just working with families or working with couples when things were kind of rocky was just clear communication. And I think your book really kind of emphasizes the importance of clear communication, and I think simplicity, is something that can make the fertile ground for that, or augment it, or whatever. But why is it that you believe clarity is like a critical skill, that both personally and professionally, from your opinion?
Oh yeah, I mean, what you mentioned before, poor communication is cited as one of the leading causes of divorce. It's the number one cause of aviation accidents, of healthcare accidents. It costs companies $402 billion estimated on a yearly basis. It's the one of the leading causes of employee dissatisfaction. It's one of the reasons that investors don't invest in companies. All of these things happen when we're not good at getting ideas from our head into somebody else's head. Right. And so what this really boils down to in terms of how this works is if you, this idea of fluency, right? And so we know the word fluency, right? We can be fluent in English or Spanish or Mandarin, or you can be fluent in your favorite TV show, or, in wine, or some, where things are easy, they're fluent. It actually comes from the Latin root for the word flowing, right? And that's kind of what it feels like.
Mm-hmm.
But if you ask a cognitive scientist about the word fluency, well, they're going to say this describes how easy is it for you to get something from out in the world, stick it in your head, and make sense of it, right? And so the easier something is, the less obstacles in that process, the more fluent it is. And it turns out that when you look at all sorts of different phenomena, if it's like stock ticker symbols, if it's images, if it's names, across all sorts of different ways which we consume information, we are prejudiced towards things that are fluent. Right? We like them better. We trust them more. We're more likely to choose them, to vote for them, purchase them. And that is obviously, when we're communicating, that's what we want, right? There's a huge body of research about this. And the inverse of that's also true, right? Which is, if something is hard to understand, if something is hard to see or hear or make sense of, well, we don't like it, we don't trust it, and we don't buy it. The things we want to avoid when we're, if we're a marketer or if we're an advocate or anything else with a message, that's what we don't want to be. So the question is then, how do we get to be more fluent?
And in that fluency, I mean, part of it is, like, you gave these examples that are, potentially catastrophic, planes going down or surgeries going bad or what have you. Those are proxies for complex circumstances, complex systems, potentially complex communication kinds of things. In the book, you talk about some strategies for simplifying these complexities. Could you maybe share some of the principles or techniques that listeners could use to streamline their communication and have that clarity that's so critical?
Yeah, certainly. And actually, I'll back up a little bit and say, why do we need these different strategies? And so when we're a receiver, and if you break down the communications equation to just basically the two parts, right? The senders and the receivers. Mm-hmm. We like to complicate it a lot, right? We say, I'm this, I'm that. But if you're a marketer, if you're an executive, if you're an advocate, if you're a teacher, you're a sender. And on the other side of it, if you are a buyer, if you're a donor, if you're a voter, you're a receiver. Right? So, and we all wear both of these hats. We go back and forth. But receivers, when we're in that role, we want something to be fluent, as we just talked about. But as a sender, we are often pulled in the other direction. We have forces inside of us like an additive bias where we're more likely to add than subtract when we're faced with an option. We have a complexity bias, more likely to see more complex patterns. These things pull us in one direction.
We want to mansplain things.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And then,
okay.
and then externally, forces also pull us in that direction, right? So there's a demand from our, our boss to add more stuff to the slide deck, right? There's demand for from the media cycle to have more stuff to announce and to share. There's all sorts of things that pull us out that way too. So what we have to look at is how can we bring ourselves as senders closer to where receivers really want us to be. And I've identified 5 principles that help us get there. 5 design principles. So I'll back up. Talk about design before. That's what my functional background is. And I don't look at this as like a rubric or a checklist, but as a, here are principles that the better we're able to kind of adhere to them or to follow them, the better we're going to be about getting fluent. So the first one is beneficial. What does it matter to the receiver? Like what's in it for them, right? What if you're in sales, this is kind of like features versus benefits, like kind of sales 101 stuff. Second one is focused. Are you trying to say one thing or multiple things at once, right? Is it one idea or is it 3 ideas in a trench coat, right? The third one is salient. Does your message stand out from the noise? Does it rise to your attention? Is it zig when others zag? The fourth is empathetic. Are you speaking in a language that the audience understands? Are you meeting them where they are in terms of both like the words themselves, but also their emotions, their motivations? And then finally, minimal. Have you cut out everything that isn't important and left only what is? And when we're talking about minimal, we're not talking about brevity. It's a little bit different. We're minimizing the friction, not necessarily the words or the slides or the pages.
I like that. I feel like that's such a good model when you sort of like call it out and shine a light on it. It makes so much sense, but it's almost like then, are these filters that you would then, have your staff run through or have students run through to say, okay, here's the project, here's what we're working on, and now let's run it through these, and let's spin it down a little more. It's too wordy, or it's it's too confusing, or we're trying to get 5 features rather than 1 benefit. How does someone then start to apply those kinds of things in a real world scenario, whatever that might be?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is when you look at this top level here, the 5 of them, it's about just checking your message against them. Are you beneficial? Are you focused? Are you salient? And there's questions that that help us get there. But within each one of them, I've identified a number of different tools. Which some are a little bit broader, some are very direct about how we can get more beneficial, right? How can we get more minimal? And so there's lots of ways in the book, and there's certainly ways outside of it to be able to get us there. Let me dive into beneficial for an example.
Okay.
So beneficial, I lied a little bit when I said this is not in order. I put this one first because I think it is the one that is probably the most important, and it's probably also the most ignored. Which is, what does it matter? What's in it for them? And so if you've ever worked in marketing or sales, you've probably heard, people don't buy features, they buy benefits, right? And there's a sentence that I tell my students every semester that I tell them, if you forget everything else from this class, from this entire degree you're getting, and you remember this, you're going to be ahead of most other people in this business. And it's not from me. It's from Theodore Levitt, who taught at Harvard in the 60s. He said, people don't want a 1/4-inch drill. They want a 1/4-inch hole.
I love that. Yeah, exactly. Here's all the features. Here's the type of motor in it, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. We often talk about the drill, but because it's there, right? We can see it. And we can feel it, and we can, smell it or taste it or touch it, but we don't really see the whole, because the whole exists in the world of the consumer, the world of the user, and what problem they have that you're solving. There's another analogy of this, which is nobody wants a mousetrap; they want dead mice, right?
Yeah. Well, and
So
I'll tell
yeah.
you too. I mean, just a quick aside, Ben, that like I did. Taught for a number of years myself, and one of the things that I noticed was always sort of missing in the curriculum. Like I would teach psychological testing and assessment of how to do certain kinds of tests, from IQ tests to personality tests and that sort of thing, and people had no idea how to bill for it, or what in medical psychological areas there's things called CPT codes. That was all Greek to them. Blah blah blah. I also taught ethics classes, and a lot of that dealt with professional ethics and professionalism and how to handle yourself, etc. But it didn't necessarily talk a whole lot about the business aspects of being able to create a private practice and function ethically that way. You weren't going to do something wrong in the clinical setting with your patient, but you might inadvertently step on your own toes when you're doing billing, because no one ever taught you how to do billing, and you make a boo-boo, not with any kind of intent, but just accidentally, and then you get in trouble. And one of the things when I would consult with people and talk about, kind of starting your private practice, or what I'd written for a couple of books with Wiley, was exactly what you're saying. But I think for me, the problem with the whoever I was writing to or talking with was that they were so proud of their degree, where they got their degree, their GPA, their all their credentials. I've got this extra credential and this license and this extra credential. And so I'd look at their website and do a critique of it, and it would be just blanketed, just thick with all honest and all true, but about how great they were, and about how they went to these great schools and did such a great job and won all these awards or whatever, and never a benefit to why a potential client would ever want to see them, to say, oh, I really help people that are struggling with depression following their divorce. And it was sort of like you kind of have to turn the ship that way too. So I mean, it applies not just with holes being drilled or those kinds of things, but I think it's fascinating to see it across a variety of different kinds of disciplines and businesses as well. So.
Oh, that is so true. I think that a lot of people forget that what's interesting to them is not necessarily what's interesting to their audience, right? They really don't care.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I don't care where you went, just that you went.
It's not my problem, right?
Right.
Some of those things are trust things, kind of signals of social proof in a way, and so that's important to an extent, but people get very wrapped up over all the different kind of details and things that they've done, without necessarily talking about, well, should I care about the audience here? What's in it for them? Slight aside from that here, it's something I recently learned, and I feel like I've known it for a while intuitively, but I've recently read the research about it, was a lot of those things, like accolades, when we're talking about, oh, I went to this school and I went to this and I have this award, we like to think that we are just sharing them and they add up, like arguments add up in the brains of our receivers, but they actually don't. They get averaged. So if some, I would tell this to a lot of folks whenever I do like a little bit of agency mentoring, is they'll put on, I've done work for this client, this client, this client, and it's like Apple, Coca-Cola, and then it's like, Joe's Barbershop around the corner. And it's like, okay, well, nothing is against Joe's Barbershop, but if I'm the prospective client and I'm on your website and I see you have Apple and Coca-Cola alone, I say, that's great. Those are some credible companies, great brands. I'm going to hire this guy. But if I see the two of them and then I see Joe's Barbershop, I say, well, wait a second. Where maybe the other two were a fluke, and maybe what this guy really does is Joe's Barbershop type of stuff.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And so the arguments actually get diluted. That's what they call a dilution effect. The more you give that social proof that is often very self-serving, it hurts you, actually.
That's interesting. I've seen, maybe again back to academia, a variation on that theme of like people kind of putting that they're at the master's level now or something, and whatever, they're trying to get a job, they're trying to get into a PhD program, whatever it might be, and you start to see these things on there that I did blah 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 in the summer, this is my summer job, and it's sort of like there's a certain point where you just quit telling people you had a paper route. It's sort of like your CV needs to have a few other things in there to fill it up. The white space, not those kinds of things. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point with the averaging. I've never kind of heard it, conceptualized that way, but that makes perfect sense. Ben, how does it deal, like in the context of we see such, and I think there's a backlash now too, having said or getting ready to say what I'm about to say, but like with influencer marketing. I mean, a lot of these influencers, they might, be, ripped or whatever. Maybe that's their social proof, or they have good skin, and that's their social proof when you want to buy a moisturizer. But how, they're not necessarily. There's probably very few PhDs that have, big influencer followings or something like that. How does that deal with it? With the juxtaposition of I'm an expert? Is it just the superficiality of the expertise of you look good and I want to do what you do? Or how do you deal with that as a professional, so to speak, with influencer?
Yeah, influencers are a tough nut to crack. I have talked to people who have made incredible hay out of working with influencers, right? Like they've gone out and they've made a ton of money and built great companies. And I've known people that have spent money on it, and it completely ends up being a waste of time and money and effort. So it's tough. If I have like a couple just kind of headline recommendations for working with influencers, you got to make sure that you're getting somebody that's the right fit for you. And that doesn't always mean the largest audience. I've worked on projects where somebody had, let's just give round numbers here. Somebody had 1,000 followers and somebody had 1 million followers. And the person with 1,000 followers sold more product than the person with 1 million followers, right? Because the 1,000 followers might be true diehard people that are buying everything this person's, talking about. And the one with 1 million might just be kind of like loose a little bit, right?
Right. It's the Kevin Kelly's 1,000 True Fans kind of concept, right? Yeah.
That's a big one.
Well, it kind of goes back to your point about dilution too. There's probably a certain point of like, there's a bazillion people. And once I start, then I start getting, kind of, I don't know, skeptical, with huge high numbers, unless it really is a name firebrand kind of person. If it's if it's an individual, not a company, of like, well, are these, did all the bots, get filtered out here? Is this, just still purchasing, fans or whatever too? You get to a point of where it sort of becomes like, it works against you that these numbers seem a little bit too high for someone that only has 100 postings or something like that to have this many followers. So, well, let me get back to the book. So one of the things too that I wanted to pick your brain about, you've said that language can have a significant impact on clarity and understanding. Are there any kind of specific linguistic techniques or strategies related to that you would recommend for improving clarity or getting rid of the ambiguity that might come up in communications?
Yeah, certainly. So when I talk about empathy, it's a lot of times, are we speaking in the same language as our audience, right? Are we literally using the same words and jargon that they understand? A couple of things are pushing against us there. So number one is we fall to this idea of the false consensus effect a lot. And so that's basically, let's say I think I'm a normal guy. I like mint chip ice cream. Therefore, I think most people like mint chip ice cream, right? But in reality, it's probably something like a few people like mint chip, but most people like chocolate and some like vanilla. So we tend to think that our own preferences and experiences are broadly representative of the population when they're not. Right? We overweight our own experience in that. When you pull this out to a group context, and we look at how, if you're on a committee at work, or if you're, working in-house on, developing the new press release of your product, you can very easily convince yourself that everybody knows what you're talking about, right? Of course, I can use this acronym. Everybody knows what it means. KPI, key performance indicator. Everybody knows what that means, right? And you throw it out there, and people are like, "What is this?" That happens with acronyms. That happens with buzzwords and jargon. And so it ends up being something that is this wall we're putting up unintentionally between our in-group and then the out-group of who we want to talk to, right? If we're not speaking in the same language as them, it just doesn't get understood. And that becomes that point of friction, right? And every bit of that friction decreases the fluency and makes it more likely somebody just kind of tunes out and they say, I don't want to care. I don't care about this anymore. I'm going to go pay attention to one of the other 1,000 things that is screaming for my attention.
Gotcha.
So that's a big piece of it. One tool to approach that challenge is to look at the 1,000 most commonly used words and use that as a basis of what you're going to do. 1,000 seems a little weird of a phrase, right? What that means is 1,000, right? If you look at the 1,000 most commonly used words in the English language, by the way, 1,000 is not one of them, which is why it's the 1,000 most commonly used words.
Very meta.
Yeah. So if you look at those words as a jumping off point, use that as a kind of a stress test for your message. If you have a press release or your email or whatever that you want to see, is this getting through? Well, there's a number of tools online. You can just kind of look up, 1,000 words. Run your text through that. It will flag all the different words that don't meet that criteria. You don't have to replace all of them, but if all of a sudden 90% of your text is in that, you go, oh, maybe I got to reword a lot of this here. And by the way, because of how we use words in almost every language, they follow this pattern known as Zipf's law. We don't have to get into like the math behind it. Basically, the most commonly used word is like basically twice as twice as frequently used as the second most common, and it goes on kind of exponentially down from there. What that tells us is when you look at like big bodies of text and they run this analysis, they see that the 100 most common words account for about 50% of English as it's used, and the 1,000 most common words account for about 75% of the language as it's used. So you can get very far with those 1,000, and then you can kind of pick and choose the ones outside of that you need to have to make your point.
That is great. Hey, it makes me think too. I'm going to take a little quick aside from the book, but just from what you said made me think of this. What do you have opinions, or have you seen good use cases with like ChatGPT or any of the AIs that are out there with filtering, editing, reviewing, starting from scratch with these kinds of things, of having that less friction, less confusing, you leaning into Zipf's law kind of thing?
So ChatGPT is famously kind of verbose.
Yeah.
If you look at
humorously verbose as well. So, yeah.
There was a study I saw making the rounds that was basically looking at the titles of different academic papers that have been submitted over the years, and they looked at the word delve. And so ChatGPT loves the word delve, right? They love the word delve. And they said, how frequently is this used in the title? And basically kind of plots along, a little bit, in 2018, a little bit in 2019, a little bit in 2020. And then all of a sudden, last year, it shoots up, right? And it's one of the like most commonly used words. And I saw another bit of research, same thing when somebody was looking at peer reviews. They looked at words like innovative and other kind of very puffy adjectives. And they took these words and they, again, same pattern, right? A little bit, and then a lot in the last year. And the funny little side note on that one is the closer it was to the deadline, the more likely it was that you were going to see those hallmarks of ChatGPT. Yeah. So that's kind of the current state of play. That doesn't mean that these tools cannot be used to help you improve your work. I think that getting the work out of it, if you're trying to get it to write something, it's, ChatGPT and these other large language models, they're very good at making things that look like the right answer, but they're not necessarily good at making things that are the right answer.
Gotcha.
And so you want to be cautious with it for that reason. However, I know somebody who used the principles from my book, basically fed the kind of learnings from the book into ChatGPT and said, hey, can you improve my, this text, improve my email with these parameters? And he said that it increased his click rate by 40%.
Wow.
Well, I'm very flattered by that. That was a very cool little
That
data
is
point.
very, yeah.
Yeah.
That's
So,
you need an app, Ben.
oh
So-
yeah, I need to get something that'll take advantage of that.
wow, that's pretty
But
cool.
that's very cool. ChatGPT and these other tools can be very good helping you improve your writing. If you put your writing in there and you ask it to tighten something up or to simplify some of the language, it will do that for you and do it pretty competently. It is not quite there yet where it can really produce original knowledge in any real capacity, though.
Yeah, I've heard the best advice I've heard around these kinds of tools is to consider it like an intern. Like that you can task it to do something, but you certainly need to, shape it and craft it and make it your own, before it goes out for public consumption.
Oh,
So,
absolutely.
one of the other things you talk about in your book is the concept of focus, in using the concept of focus to have a better connection with our audience, whoever that audience might be. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit about what your concepts are about that?
So I talk a lot in that chapter about the idea of the Frankenstein message. So when this comes up a lot with student groups that I work with, because they're inherently flat, they don't have a kind of hierarchy about who's the decider, who's the creative director. So you end up with this work where I give them like a brand, and I say, here, go make a pitch for it. I'll bring some judges in, and we'll evaluate your work. Every single time, I will get students that will, at least one group a semester, that it looks like they did it last minute. It looks like they were not necessarily paying as much
No,
attention.
that happens.
Yeah, believe it or not, undergraduates are not always. But I mean, just as an aside, some of them do incredible work. By the way, I get blown away by some of the stuff they do. But every now and then somebody comes in and they give me a presentation that says, for this brand, we're going to use slogan X and slogan Y and slogan Z. We're going to use these 3 hashtags. We're going to use influencers and drones and QR codes and AI and all of a sudden it's just everything, right? Every one of those ideas might have been great, but together they ended up worse than the sum of its parts. And I, in the book, I talk about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and when she describes the monster in the book, every individual item on the monster was selected for its beauty. It's got pearly white eyes, it's got lustrous black hair, it's got strong muscles. Every item was selected to be individually great, but put together they end up worse than the sum of their parts. They can form a gruesome composite. And that's exactly what happens in a lot of creative environments, is that if you don't have the leadership, you don't have the process, even you don't always have a dictator, but you have a process, you end up with everything just getting thrown together and taped up into one idea, into one kind of monstrous idea, instead of committing to one thing out of that would have been better if you just focused on that piece.
I love that. I love the example of that in the book. It seems, again, kind of so obvious once you kind of unpack it. One of the other things, I guess, a couple of things, I wish I could ask the same question simultaneously, but in this context, it makes me then go to your point about that effective leadership often requires clear communication. So in a circumstance like this, where you said it is kind of like flat and non-hierarchical in a undergrad class or something like that, what are ways when is it just superficial by virtue of the structure of if it's an agency that someone's the final decision maker and says, hey, this is great, and hey, this isn't finished baking yet, you need to go back to the drawing board? Or how does it work, how could a leader incorporate some of the principles in your book for motivation, but while not stagnating any kind of creativity or brainstormy kinds of stuff, but supporting it, but also saying we're not going to have a Frankenstein?
Yeah, it's hard, right? It's hard. It's easier said than done with this. Bruce Springsteen, famously the boss, said that democracy in rock bands is a ticking time bomb, right?
So, I read that quote to my wife. I love that. Yeah. I thought that was so brilliant.
It's tough because you especially in a flat organization, you don't want to hurt people's feelings. Want to make sure, and there's lots of things in organizational psychology, psychological safety, all this different stuff that is important in kind of getting there. But when you look at how creativity works is that it is often better for you to have people work independently and then come together and then go back and forth kind of in that environment than it is to just shove everybody in a room and squeeze them until something comes out. That's how some of the best, marketing agencies in the world work, is that they have their independent kind of teams. They, a couple people pair up and they work together in something, and they come back in the room and everybody pitches their ideas, and there's somebody that's the decider. Mm-hmm. That's how you mentioned SNL before. That's how SNL works, right? Like all the writers go out and they come up with their ideas and they come back and they pitch them, and then they work independently based off of the feedback there. That is often seen as the best way to produce creative work, is not to just get 10 creative people in a room until it happens, but to break up into smaller teams or units to generate ideas and come back and discuss them.
That's cool.
And actually there's some science around, if you have I believe 6 or 7 people in a room, at a certain point the number of ideas starts to go down, starts to flatline, because you just don't have the bandwidth. Only one person can really speak at a time. And once you get past around 6 or 7 people, you actually don't have any more ideas than you did when you had the smaller number of people in the room.
I love that.
Yeah. Well, that happens on Zoom, right? You ever go to like a Zoom birthday party, during COVID? Yeah. It's just one person being the MC being like, "Oh, so you're raising chickens now? How's that?" Oh,
right. Yeah. That's really a good point, because it just does not translate, even though all the bodies, all the faces, all the whatevers are there. So one of the other things I want to ask you about is constraints, like the benefit of embracing constraints on your work. Do you have an opinion on what's the anatomy of a great constraint?
So constraints are paradoxically one of those things that we think a constraint will constrain our creativity, right? Mm-hmm. It will limit our output. We won't be able to do as much stuff. But what we actually find when we look at how people behave is that it does the exact opposite. It actually forces people into areas they weren't going to be before. And so it acts as kind of a little bit of pressure, a little bit of a forcing mechanism to get you out of the safe zone, out of the metaphorical box, and into different space. If you're playing by the rules everybody else is playing, well, you're going to end up kind of doing the same thing over and over again. But if you start to have to do something a little bit different, you can't use the letter E, right? You can't, everything has to be in black and white, or, you have to use, you have to draw this thing with your left hand, all these different things. They can help us get out of a little bit of a rut that we might be in. But what it's important is it has to be a medium amount of pressure, right? So if we have a lot of pressure, let's look at time pressure, for example. We have a lot of pressure and we say that, hey, this proposal is due tomorrow. And you go, oh my God, usually we take 2 weeks to do this thing. How are we supposed to get this proposal? What happens? Well, you end up copying and pasting, right? You end up using templates, end up kind of just maybe grabbing a couple easy ideas, you throw them in there, mm-hmm. and then, hope it works. Cross your fingers and see what happens.
Right.
Yeah. And the other end of the spectrum, if you give yourself too much time to do something, well, if the proposal is due in a year, that's not my problem. That's future Ben's problem, right? Mm-hmm. He's going to deal with the proposal. And so it ends up being a kind of like too much rope to hang yourself type of thing, right? And what we really want to have is a little bit of pressure, a little bit that just kind of forces us into, imagine kind of you're pressing a balloon down, right? Like you want to force it out of the way a little bit and kind of knock it around, but you don't want to pop it. Mm-hmm. That's what we're looking for.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I'm just eyeing the clock here. I have a few more things. Are you good for time, Ben, for a little while longer?
Yeah,
absolutely. Can I pick your brain? All right. I'm going to be very mercenary here and very selfish. I want to run by you as the expert on simplicity and clarity of message. And this is also a little anxiety producing for me, so be gentle, Ben. But can I run by you our slogan for our podcast and get your feedback on it?
Yeah, happy to. It can sometimes be hard to kind of do it live,
Okay,
but
sure, fair
love to
enough.
talk.
Yeah, fair enough. So you're being put on the spot will match my anxiety of putting you on the spot. So our podcast goes like this. Basically, our little one-liner is that it's like a gym membership for your brain.
Okay. Okay.
So,
Uh,
in the context of that, give you a minute to think about this. I mean, the idea is, everybody knows what a gym membership is, and everybody, kind of knows, okay, well, that's a good thing. It's a healthy thing. I get to exercise. I get to, do whatever and build things up. And that was kind of what we were going for with that as a concept for it, and kind of a quick, just not have to sit there and mull it over and rub your chin and look up to the sky and go, what? Well, I mean, what is that? That's very, So I'm hoping it hits the of your five, I'm hoping it's hitting the brief. I hope it's hitting, it's a benefit, blah, blah, blah. So criticism, ways to tweak it. Is it good enough or just again, to put you on the spot?
yeah, I think it's pretty strong. I think it's pretty strong. So let's kind of go through it a little bit. So
Okay.
beneficial, we talked about how, it's features versus benefits, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're not saying this is interviews with smart people, hosted by another smart person, right? That would be a feature. That's what you're describing. The benefit is, this is exercise for your brain, right? That starts to get close to that principle.
Okay.
The second one is focused. I would say this is pretty much on the mark there, right? So when you see an unfocused message for something like this, it might be saying, well, we have the best guests and we have the highest production value and we have the funniest hosts or whatever. And that ends up being kind of like three different things that you're competing for instead of it being kind of one piece, which is this is something that is mentally kind of stimulating, right? And so this feels focused at first blush.
Okay.
Salient, I think that this does stand out, right? So if you look at all these other podcasts, they'll talk about like stimulating conversations or soulful conversations or this or that. Nothing's wrong with those, but that's the background. So how do you kind of stand out against that background? I think that a gym membership for your brain is just enough kind of off kilter in terms of what everything else is, that it does pique my interest a little bit more.
Okay, good.
Empathetic, is this the language that the audience is going to be in? Are they looking for a gym membership for their brain? My only concern a little bit might be the word members. I don't think there's a better version of it off the top of my head, but membership, is this a membership or is this like a gym for your brain or something like that?
Okay.
So again, you gotta test these things a little bit to see what's going to work, but that's the only part that gives me a little bit of pause for both kind of empathetic and minimal. And if you cut out everything that isn't important and kept what is, again, if you're looking at saying, is the word membership the right piece of that, or because is it the membership or is this the equipment, right? Like in that metaphor, which one is it?
Gotcha.
I think it works very well as it is right now, but that's just something maybe to kind of noodle on a little bit more.
Good. Well, awesome. Thank you. Good. That is very helpful. Yeah, and I appreciate that struggle with it too, because it's sort of like, well, is membership like, then maybe they'll subscribe, is it, being, kind of a little subconscious here, and, oh yeah, I can join this and it's, it doesn't cost me anything or whatever. But, we know what happens with gym memberships too. Sometimes they join and then never come. So
that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to wrap up with a couple of things. You also have the 3 Simple Things newsletter. So tell us about that and how interested listeners can subscribe to it.
Oh yeah, that's been a ton of fun. So I started this about a year ago. I send out exactly what's on the tin. There's 3 simple things. So the first is something for me that is going to be something either I wrote, sometimes it's an interview I've done or a talk I've done. But I've covered a lot of different things over the past year, usually adjacent to technology and communication. This week, actually, as we're talking, I just sent out this was a reshare of something I wrote a year ago which was graduation advice to my former students. Because today, this morning, is the commencement.
I just opened it today. It is an open tab. I'm looking forward to reading it, Ben. So yeah, how timely we are. So.
Oh, awesome. So that's what you get there. The second piece is something just interesting I found related to, again, communication, technology, marketing. And so that's usually a link to an article. It could be a YouTube video, it could be a podcast. And then the third is just an idea to ponder. And, usually it's kind of a piece of advice or a quote. Sometimes it's a statistic. And so it's exactly, again, what's on the label with 3 simple things. Comes out every Tuesday, totally free. If you go to my website, benguttmann.com, you'll get a pop-up for it. It'll be on the homepage. By the way, Ben Guttmann is Guttmann, 2 T's and 2 N's. Not a great name for radio, but you got to put both of them in there to get to me.
Got it. Good. I'm glad you called that out. We'll have it in all the titles and things as well too. So, hey Ben, we've covered a lot, but is there anything that we haven't touched on yet that you'd like to share before we wrap?
Oh, this has been a ton of fun. I really appreciate it. By the way, if anybody wants to get the kind of free chapter of the book, that's also available on my site, benguttmann.com. Go grab that. And so that's got the intro and the first chapter.
Great.
But I'll leave you with this one.
Go ahead. I do want to get that shouted out here, and we'll put it in the show notes too, in terms of getting the book, following your work, connecting, etc. What are some of the best ways? And we'll put this in the show notes, but go ahead and shout them out now.
Yeah. So you mentioned the newsletter, the free chapter. Go grab that on my site, or connect to me on LinkedIn. Send me a follow, and send me an email if this has been something that's been useful to you. I do speaking, I do consulting, and happy to help team up on something.
Great. We'll put those in.
I'll give you the one kind of takeaway here, which is just as if you were sending a letter, you have to pay for the postage. When you are sending a message, it is your responsibility as the sender to make sure that it's getting across, that it's getting heard, that it's getting understood. The receiver, when we're a receiver, we have so many things competing for our attention, right? We woke up today and we cared about our dog or our vacation or our work deadline, but nobody had on their to-do list, I want to click on some Instagram ads, right? I want to open the spam emails. Every ad you've ever received, ever seen, ever listened to has been against your will, right? And so it's important for us when we're in a position of communicating that we have that humility, that we have that respect, and that we understand our responsibility as part of the communications equation.
That is great. That borders on the poetic there, Ben. That's a great wrap. So I just want to say to listeners too, as a reminder, you can get a summary of this episode and links to the show notes, etc., via my LinkedIn Top Voice companion article that will come out when this show hits, as well as past episodes as well. And Ben, I have to say, to put it simply, thank you for your work and all you do. It's been great to spend this time with you. I really have appreciated it, my friend.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Living a Life in Full is a production of Stout Media, a subsidiary of Gordian Knot, LLC. Assistant producer, Gracie Wong. Music, Dan O'Brien. Executive producer and host, Dr. Chris Stout. To learn more, stop by our website at Life in Full for show notes. And please recommend us to your friends and subscribe on your favorite platform. And as for the obligatory disclaimer, this podcast is for general information uses only and does not constitute the practice of psychology, medicine, nutrition, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical or psychological advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, I take conflicts of interest seriously. For all of my disclosures as well as show notes, please see livingalifeinfull.org/podcast and my LinkedIn profile. Thanks, and until next time.